everyone. My name is Annabel Harris, and I'm the book club coordinator for the Queen's College Translation Exchange. Our book for this term is Out of Time, a collection of short stories by Palestinian writer Samira Azzam, and I'm very happy to be here today with Ranya Abdel Rahman, literary translator from Arabic and the translator of this collection, and Marcia Lynx Qualey, the editor. Marcia also runs ArabLit, the award-winning literary translation project, website and quarterly magazine, who have partnered with us on the book clubs this term. Welcome, both of you. Thank you so much for being here with me.
Thank you, Annabel. It's great to be here.
Thank you, Annabel.
So I wondered if you could start by telling us a little bit about how you each came to this project in particular.
Right. Well, okay, I'll start, Ranya, if that's okay with you. So I think, I started ArabLit in 2009, and I can't remember when I first heard about Samira Azzam, but her name kept coming up as somebody whose work should be there's of the incredible wide world of Arabic literature. There are publishing houses and projects to translate classical Arabic literature, so before the 20th century, and there's publishing projects and publishers interested in very contemporary literature of living authors. But early 20th century literature generally falls into some kind of a gray zone. And I kept hearing about Samira Azzam and how she was, sort of criminally not translated into English, and also that she had not really received sufficient attention from literary critics in Arabic either. And I think it was Adania Shibli, the great contemporary novelist and short story writer, who kind of nudged me in this direction of, come on, we need to make this happen. And if we can't interest, say, Penguin Books in it, we just need to do it. Bring Samira Azzam into English. So, and then, of course, it required a really sensitive, skilled translator who could really take the time with bringing these stories into English. And so then I asked Ranya, would you be interested in doing this?
And I'll just pick it up from here. I hadn't heard of Samira Azzam when Marcia suggested her work to me. So I started by just reading the stories, because I thought I would be spending time with this collection, and I wanted to see if they would speak to me. And I was just so fascinated by her work. The stories are so varied, and on the surface, they sound like just ordinary stories about ordinary people. But then you finish reading it and you start to think that there's a lot more going on there, and they really spoke to me. So I was delighted to work on the stories, and then I read about Samira's own history and found out what an admirable writer she was, and person in general, and an important figure in Palestinian literature.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that how they're sort of ordinary stories on the surface. This is something Adania mentions as well, that her work was one of the few writers who was not censored in her education growing up, few who was not removed, Palestinian writers who were not removed from the curriculum. And this was because her writing was considered by the Israeli authorities to be non-threatening. But Adania, reading it, found it tremendously political in this, in the sense of, being interested in Palestinian lives, I think, and the sort of the power of that. So I think there are so many layers to her stories, and it does not easily fit into any of the sort of boxes that one might expect of Palestinian literature, and that is possibly one of the reasons why it fell out of fashion for a while. But they are these powerful stories of this mosaic of humanity, not just in Palestine, but across the Levant, the region that includes Lebanon and Syria.
Right.
And she writes, I just wanted to say that one of the things that really struck me is how empathetic she was, and how she can really kind of inhabit so many different characters who are completely different from her in terms of age or gender or even social class. But she deals with them so sensitively and brings them across so vividly in her stories.
Except for, as I always say when Ranya says this, she's less than sympathetic to the one really wealthy woman who appears in these stories. That's really the only character who I would say she's making fun of, rather than the humor comes out because we are sympathetic with the characters.
I definitely came away from the translation stunned by that sense of empathy and range. And perhaps some particularly good examples of that broad scope are the 3 short stories that you've chosen for us to discuss at the book club. Could you take us through them?
So if we want to start with, say, the rock flew over Shahraban, Ranya. So one of the things that I find really interesting, so this is an earlier story. This is a story where people are grappling with tremendous social change, including the social change of a gigantic airplane flying overhead, of the arrival of this strange thing of trains and train lines. And many of her stories, I think, take place in these great moments of upheaval, either social and cultural upheaval or personal upheaval. And I find that sort of resonates with the sort of great upheaval of Palestine and Palestinian people. And you could talk more specifically about this story, Ranya.
Well, I find in the Rock Flew Over Shahraban, she there's a great sense of atmosphere in it. I mean, right from the beginning, you feel it's this kind of tension and the darkness. I agree with you very much about the upheaval, and I feel like this story is different from a lot of her other stories in that it's set in recent history. I think it sets sometime around World War One, when it was the Ottoman Empire and the British were fighting in the Caucasus. And she really brings across, for example, the sense of loss of Radi's mother, who lost her son twice, once to war, and then again to ignorance, we can say. And also Radi's character, even though we don't have any physical description of him, it comes through so clearly. You just get the sense of this intrepid young man who managed to save himself from all the horrors of war and get himself home across all those borders. And then, even though he could have taken the easy way out and just said, renounced what he'd seen, he just, he's a young man, and he said no. He sticks to his story, and I think that's also it really brings through who he was. And one last thing is some of the little details that Azzam puts in. For example, this is a story published in 1963, but she mentions the Indian troops who were there with the British army, coming out of the trains. So even though her stories seem so straightforward, there's an incredible amount of thought that seems to have gone into them.
Yeah, I think so. So then we talk about Tears from a Glass Eye, let's say, which is the opening story in the collection. And one of the things that really that I love about this story is, as Ranya said, the tremendous sympathy that we have for this man who is like kind of an absurd character. Who is somewhat ridiculous. He has this job that this job that he's created for himself of crafting poetry that he kind of funeral crashes and recites in the hope of getting a tip. And the narrator of it, the man who sort of takes us through this story, and introduces us to this character, his I think part of the wonderful sensitivity of it is in the ways in which he sees this person throughout the story, and how his view changes, and then thus how our view of him changes as well.
I agree, Marcia. And this is one of the stories where it's interesting. It's one of the very few stories where I've seen she actually uses physical description. And in this one, we get a really detailed sense of the man, how the man looks, and also all his little mannerisms, how he hides the paper under his tarbush, the way he walks, I find this one interesting because it's in one. It was published in one of the collections that came out after she died, and I don't know whether she'd written it a long time earlier and decided not to publish it, or whether it was a newer and one of her newer stories. But I did find it different in that sense.
Yeah, it's also sort of gives you a wonderful sense of culturally of not just him and his life, but funerals, funeral practices, and just like a sense of the whole world going on around him in this very small space. And also, he describes him, our shameless friend has skin so thick no amount of pummeling can penetrate it, regardless of how the mourners pull at his sleeve, having heard his poem at 20 other funerals, he won't stop. We do in the end really feel deeply sympathetic for this character, even though we can also see how he's, in some ways very foolish. Maybe we can then also see how we are also foolish, all of us.
Yes, and also perhaps, I mean, it definitely made me question, because I felt so much sympathy for him, and she shows how he finds dignity in what he's doing. So it made me kind of think, how sometimes you think about people like that as scroungers, as people who are kind of living off other people, and this makes you really question your assumptions, I think.
Yeah, she does have a number of characters who make their living from some kind of, what you could call begging. You could call what he does begging, but they are, infusing it with some kind of ethic of their own, some kind of story, some kind of narrative that they bring to it as well, and some kind of pride and dignity also. I think all of these characters bring dignity to what they do. And then if we want to talk about the third story, On the Road, this is one of the story that I like. Of these, this is the of the three that we've chosen. This is the story that centers on a woman character. Of course, she has many others, but of those three, and I really enjoy a lot the kind of fire in this character. I enjoy many of her women characters. Of a range of ages. This is a younger woman who is first, when we meet her, she has one attitude towards her engagement, and at the end she has a quite different attitude, and she also is infused with the dignity of her own life. One of the things that I really enjoy about the story is the description at the end, and how things change from being her size, the things around her change from being her size and sort of equal to her, so that she can sort of move through the landscape, to being sort of gigantic, bigger than her, so overwhelming.
Yes, it gets a bit surreal at the end, doesn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
And in this story, I guess we can see, even very briefly, a little bit of skewering of privilege, because when the protagonist thinks about the rich women, they're these plump women with perfectly manicured hands and wearing jewelry, and all they do, sitting around gossiping all day. And also the the manager or the owner of the factory who's in the car, we only see him for like in two lines, but you get the idea that he's this arrogant man who just waves his cigar and kicks her out of the car.
Right. Or as you've said to me, Ranya, we don't exactly know what happened, but from her perspective, certainly she feels sort of physically shoved out of the way of she's expecting her fiance to give her a ride home, but he ends up with the manager, and she's not allowed in the car, and suddenly she has such a different attitude towards herself, her world, her fiance, the manager, who she says, no matter how high we stretch, we can't reach the manager's finger, the finger that, with a mere flick, has pushed me away from the car and left me to the storm. And so now, presumably, she has to walk home on her own through the rain, which is pretty terrible.
No,
boo to the fiance, boo.
Yeah. I found that so heartbreaking. Both of you have alluded there to kind of how the textual detail kind of creates the impressions that we feel. What was it like trying to recreate that minute textual detail in your translations, Ranya? Were there any particular problems you encountered?
It's Samira Azzam's work. When you read it, you think, oh, it's it's so simple, but then you start looking at the different layers. So in, for example, Tears from a Glass Eye, one of the things that where I stumbled a little was just the word she uses. It's for funeral, or not. It's actually not funeral. The word is aza in Arabic, and that means a gathering where the bereaved family accepts condolences. So it's not the funeral, the body isn't actually there. But I initially translated it condolence gathering. But then you'd have sentences like, having heard his poem at 20 other condolence gatherings, which is a bit clunky. So funeral isn't an accurate translation. And I had a hard time letting go of the fact that it's not actually a funeral. But in the end, translation, I think there's a lot of compromise that you have to make, and you have to decide what you're losing and what you're gaining. And in this case, with Marcia's help, we decided to go for funeral because I think it's this. In essence, it's a gathering to mourn the dead, and it's important for the reading experience also to try and make it as smooth as possible for the reader, so they can enjoy the story.
Yeah, and I think we just, we have to accept that mourning practices are very different from culture to culture, and funeral is maybe the best that we can do.
Yes. Another example I just thought I'd share from this story is a figure of speech. So the protagonist, the old man, says I'm going to translate literally first. He says, "Don't our faces contain any remnants of water?" And then the narrator says, "I look at his face, searching for where these remnants might be." Now, this is a play on an Arabic expression that literally translates to "saving the face is water," which is similar to "saving face" in English. It means avoiding humiliation, but she doesn't use it in a straightforward way. It's a play on an idiom, and basically the man is saying we still have a little dignity left. So that's how I ended up translating it, and then I study his expression for any trace of dignity. And what I wanted to say about this is that, sometimes there's a perfect expression, equivalent expression in the other language. And here, at first glance, Saving Face sounded like it might be perfect, but it didn't actually work. But she has a repetition in the Arabic, so she repeated the word remnant. So then I repeated the word dignity just to try and echo some of the rhythm of the source language, because I know that perhaps the students at school who are interested in translation might be listening to this. So I just thought that it might be interesting to think about how it's not always as easy as it looks.
Yes.
Does it look easy, Ranya?
At first, yes, you think so.
I guess the results make it look very easy to us when we read it and see how beautifully you've done it. But yeah, it's nice to get an insight into how the process is much more complicated, and there are so many things to balance in terms of rhythm, literal meaning.
Yeah, Marilyn Booth says this lovely thing about titles in particular, and I think that applies to sort of sayings and certain phrases, which is either you can see immediately how it's going to work, right? You see immediately how a title could translate, like Barid al-Layl should have translated very beautifully and well to the Night Post. Or you look at a title like Sayyidat al-Qamar, which you could say Ladies of the Moon, Mistresses of the Moon by Jukh al-Hardi, and you just know it's never going to work literally, and you need to do something else with it.
Yes. There's one more, if we have time for one more example, just from The Rock. The Rock Flew Over Shahraben, and this was a phrase which ended up being "Oh my heart and soul," but actually means "I am willing to be sacrificed for the sake of him," which is a term of endearment, meaning that you love someone so much that you're willing to give up your life for them. And we had a long discussion about whether "Oh my heart and soul" brings out the sense of sacrifice and the deep love, and we went in a long circle going into long sentences, and then we decided that also being brief is important, rather than going into a long explanation of what it means in the original language.
Yeah, I think, prose has this ability, sometimes you can expand to a certain extent, right? It's not like a poem where you really need to or a children's book where you need to be careful of every single word. But then again, on the other hand, the more you do expand, the more unwieldy something can become. And brevity, particularly if there's brevity in the original, and here with short stories, there definitely is, then I think brevity also is important.
Okay, that seems like a good place to leave it then. Thank you so much for talking to me today, both of you.
Thank you, Annabel.
Thank you, Annabel. It's been a pleasure.